I'd like to call this hearing to order this morning, and the subject of this hearing is American Jobs Now, and we're going to be considering H.R. 3548, the North American Energy Access Act. I would also like to welcome those members of the referee training class. I didn't realize y'all were going to be with us this morning, but we're delighted you're here on the second row, and hope you'll enjoy the hearing as well. Today's hearing gives us the opportunity to learn why the Obama administration denied a permit to build the Keystone Pipeline from Canada through parts of the United States. How could the Obama administration, when presented with the chance to create thousands of jobs and at the same time significantly reduce our dependence on oil from the Middle East, say no to the American people? Today, we will examine how such a harmful decision was made and explore opportunities to reverse that decision while the administration struggled to find a rational decision to reject the construction of Keystone Pipeline. We're going to look for ways to build the Keystone Pipeline. This is a project that would cost about $7 billion to build. There would not be any government money involved in this project. It is all being supplied by private industry, and it would immediately put at least 20,000 people to work. That certainly sounds like the national interest to me. If our president decides that sending 3 aircraft carrier strike groups to the Strait of Hormuz to defend the free flow of oil, if he thinks that's in the national interest, then one would also think a pipeline from Canada that would help us be less dependent on Middle Eastern oil would also serve the national interest. The President's own State Department determined that the pipeline would have no significant impact on the environment. The President said it himself. His rejection of the Keystone Pipeline is not based on its merits. He said that, which makes us believe that the decision to reject the pipeline was solely a political decision to help him be reelected. This time I would like to yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Terry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing on this bill. A couple of points with the couple of minutes I have. This is what the State Department has by way of environmental studies on the Keystone route. As you can see, it's very voluminous, and it's difficult to understand why this would just be discarded. And we'll get into some of the points later during questioning. I want to go off my regular script and just express my displeasure that the State Department decided or objected to our Nebraska witness that could help put in context the Nebraska exemption and what Nebraska is doing. The State Department objected because they don't sit on the same panel as a state witness. So the head of our Nebraska Department of Environmental Quality is not worthy enough to sit there, and because of then time constraints, his ability to answer our questions had to be deleted from this panel, and frankly, I'm disturbed by that. But we're going to get into the false excuse of using the state of Nebraska as the reason, reading your testimony, as the reason for the denial. In fact, the bill was written so you wouldn't have to make that decision, and we'll get into those statements. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman for yielding back. I might say also that last night the President in his State of the Union address talked about the importance of infrastructure for America to remain competitive.
Mr. Chairman, I'm really going to have to say that, regular order isn't in order, and the 5 minutes is up, so we should proceed because the regular order is up. The time is up, Mr. Chairman.
Well, I think when you said that, there were still 30 seconds
Mr.
left.
Chairman,
But
I looked at it, and it was
We'll
5
enforce,
minutes.
we will enforce the 5-minute rule, and I
Please.
recognize the gentleman for 5
Thank you,
minutes.
Mr. Chairman. Thank you for recognizing me. Mr. Chairman, I am also delighted to see the referees there. This is a good opportunity for them to exercise their craft, because I expect to be a big battle to take place this morning at this morning's hearing. Because, Mr. Chairman, today we're holding yet another hearing on the Keystone XL pipeline as a follow-up to the last hearing, the last markup, and the floor vote we had where the majority attempted to force the Obama administration to hastily make a decision on the Keystone XL pipeline. Let me remind you, the majority first tried to move legislation that required the administration to forego its legal obligations and its due diligence and come out with a favorable decision for Keystone XL by November 1 of last year. In the majority's reckless and irresponsible view, so be it if the American public was left unprotected because the administration did not have the time needed to conduct a thorough review. I want to repeat, a thorough review and oversight of this project. For my Republican colleagues, as long as industry got what it wanted, then that was the most important role of this Congress. After that tactic failed, the majority held hostage the payroll tax cut extension, which would benefit millions of middle-class working families, in order to attach a rider that attempted to force President Obama to come out in favor of Keystone XL within 60 days of the bill's enactment. And we all know how well that strategy worked out. Again, the majority said, too bad, if ordinary Americans might have been negatively impacted by a lack of federal oversight. And who cares if the Republican governor and the legislature of Nebraska have yet to even identify a new route for the pipeline. As was a theme all last year, my Republican colleagues continue to push this false notion that if you would just roll back government oversight and protections for average Americans and allow industry to do what it wants without restriction and unfettered, then somehow, miraculously, jobs will be created and millions of out-of-work Americans will be gainfully employed. After all, Mr. Chairman, we saw how well this well-defined philosophy worked during the Bush years with the collapse of our total financial institutions and our economy. Mr. Chairman, it's ironic that 25 Energy and Power Subcommittee and joint hearings, the 9 bills that originated from this subcommittee that went to pass the House last year, the only piece of legislation that actually became law was the Pipeline Safety Reauthorization Bill, which expanded regulation in order to address public safety. In fact, the Pipeline Safety Bill enjoyed unanimous support from this committee, and so it would appear that my Republican colleagues are not always opposed to federal regulation and oversight, especially when their districts are directly affected. So, Mr. Chairman, today we are here on another proverbial fishing expedition by the majority party, again to try to sidestep federal regulations and oversights in order to help industry get what they want and the American public be damned in the process. I'm not sure if the majority's goal is simply to show TransCanada that they are working feverishly on their behalf for more campaign contributions. even when they know that the underlying legislation would never ever become law.
Mr. Chairman,
or if they're trying to keep this issue on the front burner on a dual track to go along with the millions of dollars the American Petroleum Institute is pouring into commercials supporting Keystone XL.
Gentleman's time
That
has
I will yield
expired.
back the balance of my time.
Now,
The gentleman
Who was
made
seeking that recognition?
a accusation of saying that we're tied to campaign contributions. That's wrong, but that's against our rules. His words need to be taken down.
We'll have the clerk review the transcript, and I would, and then we will proceed at that point. And I would remind everyone that we do not need to be making accusations about what people are and are not doing as far as legal campaign finance laws and whatever. At this time, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Michigan for 5 minutes, Mr. Upton, the chairman of the full committee.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I noticed we have a number of referees in that second row. Welcome to the big house. I note that you've got red flags, and of course, it's not a yellow flag, that's a red flag. A red flag usually means it's a review of the play. We look forward to having a review of the play. In fact, that vote did pass in this committee and on the House floor by a 2-to-1 margin, and we're looking to have the ruling on the field confirmed again and perhaps again and again. It's not often that Congress can take a single step that will simultaneously help reduce the future price at the gas pump, strengthening the nation's energy security and create literally tens of thousands of jobs. And it's certainly not often that we can accomplish all of these important goals at absolutely no cost to the taxpayer. But that's exactly what approving the Keystone XL pipeline expansion project would do, and why I support this legislation, H.R. 3548, the North American Energy Access Act. Keystone is a shovel-ready project whose construction would create badly needed jobs. Once completed, it would allow more oil from our ally Canada to come to the U.S., taking the place of imports from far less friendly producers. The oil would go to refineries in the Midwest and the Gulf Coast, increasing the supply of American-made gas and preserving domestic refining jobs. The pipeline would also provide an outlet for the growing supplies of domestic oil produced in the Bakken Formation in North Dakota and Montana, relieving a potential bottleneck there. And every penny of the $7 billion project will be paid for by the private sector. Given the many benefits of Keystone, it is no surprise that so many Americans consider this decision to be a no-brainer, especially since the environmental impacts of the project have been extensively studied for years and found to be minimal. Last July, the House passed a bill requiring the State Department to make the long overdue decision on Keystone by November 1st. It was certainly bipartisan, 47 Democrats joining nearly all the Republicans in supporting the reasonable measure. Bill probably would have garnered even more votes if not for the administration's repeated assurances that it's going to make a decision before the end of 2011 and that a legislative deadline was not necessary. But sadly, as the end of the year approached, the administration reversed position and postponed its decision until 2013 at the earliest. In response, Congress gave the President a second chance to do the right thing by providing him yet another 60 days to approve Keystone as part of the payroll tax bill. But last week, he decided to reject the proposal after only 26 days. You see, 60 days wasn't enough. Make no mistake, time is of the essence. Not only are there unemployed Americans anxiously looking for jobs, not only is Iran threatening the Straits of Hormuz, not only is the price at the pump headed towards perhaps $5 in the next couple of months, but the Canadian government is understandably growing impatient with the endless red tape and delays coming from Washington. Canada is rapidly increasing its oil production, and if the U.S. foolishly refuses to be a customer for these new supplies, Canada will build yet a pipeline not to the south, but to the Pacific coast, and the oil will be exported to China, where they're waving their hands because they want it there. That's why we are again offering an opportunity to approve Keystone. I believe that this approach, this legislation, giving the decision-making authority to the FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, is a good one. I look forward to moving it through the committee, and I would yield to anyone on our side that would like time, and if not, we'll yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from California for 5 minutes, Mr. Waxman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today we once again consider legislation to approve the Keystone XL tar sands pipeline. This legislation exempts one pet project from every federal and state permitting requirement. Yes, one project would be exempted from every review. Now, is that a way to approve an important and controversial pipeline? I hardly think that's the case. The fact is that the legislation we're considering today is an earmark that benefits just one project. You remember the Republicans saying they were against earmarks? Well, not when it helps their friends. And the arguments for the project just does not stand up to scrutiny. This tar sands pipeline won't boost our energy independence or lower gas prices or create the inflated jobs being promised. Why have the Republicans introduced bill after bill to short-circuit the permitting process on Keystone XL? They say it will make the country more energy independent. That's a myth. Oil prices are set by the global markets. This pipeline will have no impact on our vulnerability to price spikes or Iranian brinkmanship. In fact, Keystone won't even reduce our imports. It will simply allow Canadian oil companies to use the United States as a conduit for shipping their tar sands overseas to China. Now, I know they say that if they don't get this pipeline, they're going to go to the West Coast. Well, that's a problem because there are First Nations in Canada who don't want this pipeline going in that direction, and it's not so clear that you get the approval to do that. The Republicans say it will cut gasoline prices, but the opposite will happen. Canadian oil that is now being refined in the Midwest and suppressing prices in the market will be diverted to the Gulf Coast for export, costing consumers in the Midwest billions of dollars. The Republicans say they support the pipeline because it will create tens of thousands of jobs, but that's not right either. According to TransCanada, the company seeking to build the Keystone XL pipeline, the project will have, quote, a peak workforce of approximately 3,500 to 4,200 construction personnel. Now, some labor groups have recently described the GOP's antics on Keystone as the politics-as-usual strategy of a do-nothing Republican Congress. If the Republicans were seriously and actually concerned about jobs, they'd work with the President in passing his jobs bill. They have no solution to the jobs crisis. The jobs crisis, they say, must be responded to by tearing away regulations to protect public health and safety. We'll have more jobs if we let billionaires keep more money. It'll trickle down to more jobs. And then they say this one project will provide the jobs we need. It's amazing to me. The fact is, the legislation we are considering today is one that is hard to understand. We asked the Koch brothers whether this was, this committee has an obligation to understand who benefits from this legislation. Last year, news organizations reported that one company, Koch Industries, would be one of the big winners if this pipeline were constructed. We asked Koch whether this was true, and were told they have no interest whatsoever in the pipeline. But then we learned that they've told the Canadian government that they have a direct and substantial interest. Something does not add up. To understand this situation better, Mr. Rush and I requested we invite the Koch brothers or the Koch Industries to come here and testify. The chairman hasn't even responded to our letter. We therefore, Mr. Chairman, are invoking the minority's rights under Rule 11 of the House rules to have a minority days of hearing. It's important we hear from the Koch and other stakeholders. I think this pipeline is a bad idea. It ignores the concerns of the...
Gentleman's time's expired. I would also tell the gentleman, we will certainly accept the letter and we will follow the rules, but we are not going to be subpoenaing the Koch brothers, and we're not asking the Koch brothers to appear because the Koch brothers have nothing to do with this project.
Well, how does the chairman know that
At this time, I would like to...
Point of order, Mr. Chairman. You've made a statement where you were not recognized for the time. You cut me out in the middle of a sentence. I'd like to know the substantiation for your...
Your time was up, Mr. Waxman. Now, we're going to recess this hearing for 10 minutes, and then we're going to come back.
Are you calling the Koch brothers during the recess?
Let me tell you something. If you want to talk about that, let's talk about the millions of dollars that the Obama administration gave companies like Solyndra to people like George Kaiser, who was out there bundling money for the president.
Chairman.
Would you like for us to? Would you like for us to
Chairman.
subpoena him too?
Why are you interrupting members and then you take unlimited time for yourself?
I'm responding to your questions, your allegations. I'm the chairman, and I'm telling you right now we're going to recess for 10 minutes.
How they gonna go on taking the word, my words down, and what's his strategy?
Morning, Gene. My man.
All right, y'all ready to rock and roll? 0 in the morning, man.
You really like this stuff?
Huh?
You really like this stuff?
You know, we having some early morning fireworks. That's good. We wake people up. So, how's Mars doing, man? Have you heard?
Who?
Mars.
Just what's been. This is still on.
Call the hearing back to order, and at this time, we'll hear the testimony of our two witnesses, and I would like to welcome both of you to this hearing today. First of all, we have the Honorable Carrie Ann Jones, who is Assistant Secretary of State, Bureau of Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs. And we also have Mr. Jeffrey Wright, who is Director, Office of Energy Projects at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So once again, I welcome you all to the hearing. Each one of you will be recognized for 5 minutes, and then we'll have questions for you at that time. So Ms. Jones, I'll recognize you for your 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, Mr. Chairman. And
be sure and turn your microphone on.
Oh, okay. I think it's on. Good morning, Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Rush, and other members of the Subcommittee on Energy and Power. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today. The U.S. Department of State received the application for Keystone XL Pipeline project in September 2008. We undertook a thorough, rigorous, and transparent process to determine whether issuance of a presidential permit for this pipeline was in the national
Would you
interest.
please pull the mic closer to you? Thank
How's
you.
that? Is that better?
That's much better.
Okay. I think you know that first part already. In December, Congress passed the Temporary Payroll Tax Cut Continuation Act of 2011, which required a determination by the President within 60 days of whether the Keystone XL pipeline project would serve the national interest. On January 18, 2012, the Department of State recommended to the President that the application for a presidential permit be denied due to insufficient time to conduct the necessary analysis. The President accepted our recommendation and determined that the Keystone XL pipeline project, as presented and analyzed at that time, would not serve the national interest. I would like to provide some further details about this process and also comment briefly on the administration's view of H.R. 3548. On April 30th, 2004, President Bush issued Executive Order 13337, which designated and empowered the Department of State to receive the applications for presidential permits for all oil infrastructure projects that cross a U.S. border. The executive order indicates that the permit should be granted based on whether it is in the national interest. The Department's national interest determination factors include numerous issues, including energy security, foreign policy, economic effects, health, safety, and environmental considerations, including climate change, as well as any other factor the Department believes is relevant to the national interest. To make an informed decision, the Department is directed in the executive order to request additional information as needed from the applicant. In order to analyze the potential environmental impacts of the project as required by the executive order, the Department determined that it would prepare an Environmental Impact Statement, or EIS, consistent with NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969. We also carried out processes mandated by the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 and the Endangered Species Act. Following NEPA requirements, we engaged in a robust public outreach effort, including meetings along the proposed pipeline route. On August 26, 2011, we issued the final EIS. Following its issuance, we began an interagency review period for the national interest determination, and we conducted an additional public comment period that closed on October 9, 2011. We held meetings along the pipeline route, including in the Sandhills. These meetings were passionate, with strong opinions and rationales on both sides. In Nebraska, we heard concerns about the fragile and unique sandhills of Nebraska. We heard about their importance to the nation and to the people of Nebraska. Indeed, the people of Nebraska felt so strongly about this issue that their legislators met in special session to draft a law to ensure the sandhills would be protected. That is why we paused the process in November 2011. And based on experience with pipelines of similar length, we estimated that it would take until early 2013 to complete our assessment. In December 2011, as we were cooperating with Nebraska's Department of Environmental Quality, the Temporary Payroll Tax Cut Continuation Act was enacted into law. We knew that 60 days was not enough time to complete the work and the analysis needed relevant to the national interest determination. We decided, based not on the merits, but on the inadequate time period and the incomplete review, to recommend that the President deny the permit. This now brings me to H.R. 3548. The proposed legislation imposes narrow time constraints and creates automatic mandates that prevent an informed decision. We also feel the legislation raises serious questions about existing legal authorities and appears to override foreign policy and national security considerations implicated by a cross-border permit, which are properly assessed by the State Department. Mr. Chairman, internationally we remain fully engaged with all our key partners and suppliers, including Canada, as we work on issues of energy security and diplomacy. As we do this, the State Department remains committed to carrying out its responsibilities under the executive order with diligence and fairness to the applicants, but with ultimate concern for the best interests of the American people. Thank you again for this opportunity to testify, and I would be pleased to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Jones. Mr. Wright, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Rush, and members of the subcommittee, my name is Jeff Wright, and I'm the Director of the Office of Energy Projects at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today. The Office of Energy Projects is responsible for, among other things, the certification of interstate natural gas pipelines pursuant to the Natural Gas Act. H.R. 3548, the North American Energy Access Act, addresses the Keystone XL pipeline project. I have no position on the proposed bill, but should Congress direct the Commission to act on an application for the project, the Office of Energy Projects, as the Commission's infrastructure review branch, would likely take a primary role in advising the Commission on the matter. Therefore, I will offer comments on the proposed bill with the goal of seeking to ensure that if Congress gives this responsibility to the Commission, the legislation should provide clear and effective procedures for conducting this review. Before commenting on specific sections, I do note that the authorization provided by the bill would differ substantially from the Natural Gas Act in that the proposed act does not make any explicit provision for procedures such as public notice, public comment, issuance of an order supporting a Commission decision, rehearing, or judicial review in conjunction with the Commission's consideration of an application. I now turn to specific provisions of the Act. Section 3A of the bill would require the Commission to approve the project within 30 days of receipt of an application, and if the Commission has not acted on the application within these 30 days, the application is deemed approved. The 30-day deadline would not permit construction of an adequate record or allow for meaningful public comment in arriving at a decision. In fact, Section 3 could be read as giving the Commission no discretion in the issuance of the permit. This section also states that the permit is to be implemented in accordance with the terms of the final environmental impact statement. However, it is not clear whether the Commission or any other entity would have authority to ensure and enforce compliance with the measures required by that document. Section 3B1 allows for the applicant or permit holder to propose a modification of the route or other terms of the final environmental impact statement and for the Commission to authorize such a modification. The bill, however, does not articulate a standard or a process for such a decision. Section 3B2 of the bill states that the Commission will enter into a memorandum of understanding with the State of Nebraska for an effective and timely review under the National Environmental Policy Act of any route modification of the project in the State of Nebraska. Upon approval of the modification by the Governor of Nebraska, the Commission will have 30 days to finish its review and to approve the modification, and Section 3B3 provides that if the Commission has not acted within 30 days, the modification shall be deemed approved. The proposed process here is unclear. The bill appears to contemplate that some entity, either the Commission or the State, will issue a NEPA document regarding a Nebraska modification, after which the Governor of Nebraska will have the opportunity to approve the proposal. The Commission then would have 30 days to complete consideration of and approve such modification. The section could be read to mean that the Commission has no discretion but to approve a Nebraska modification, and further, the section does not appear to provide a process for public notice and comment, opportunity for hearing or rehearing. Section 4 of the proposed legislation states that a permit issued under this act shall be the sole legal authority required to construct and operate the pipeline, except for the safety oversight of the Department of Transportation's Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration and the Commission's existing rate and tariff authority. The language makes it unclear whether such permits from other federal agencies would still be required. Further, while the Department of State is responsible for issuing the presidential permit that authorizes the border crossing facilities, individual states or subdivisions thereof, depending on state law, have authority to site oil pipelines within their jurisdiction. This proposed legislation could be construed as providing that federal jurisdiction supplants local authority. This concludes my testimony, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wright. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions. Ms. Jones, on October 15th, 2010, Secretary of State Clinton said she was inclined to approve the Keystone Pipeline permit. On October 31st, 2011, White House Press Secretary Jay Carney stated the fact is that this is a decision that will be made by the State Department. And the very next day, President Obama said the decision would rest with him. But in the President's announcement last week to reject the pipeline's permit, he said he had accepted the State Department's recommendation to do so. So my question would be, were you involved in the decision made at the State Department, and did you recommend to the President that he reject this permit?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The recommendation that went to the President was a State Department recommendation, and it came from from my bureau and other bureaus. It came through the Deputy and through the Secretary to the President.
So your bureau recommended that
Yes,
the
sir.
permit be denied?
Yes, sir.
And what other bureaus at the State Department was involved in that decision-making?
The other bureau that is involved is the Bureau of Economic Affairs. The State Department looks at this pipeline across all of the issues that are involved. So there are multiple bureaus involved in all of the meetings and discussions that we have. We also have some energy expertise, and we also have, of course, the Regional Bureau, which handles matters with Canada.
Yeah. Now, I think Mr. Walden over there has a copy of the impact statement, which is quite voluminous. But isn't it true that the State Department's draft environmental impact statement concluded that the Keystone Pipeline would have limited adverse environmental impact?
Mr. Chairman, what the statement said was it suggested that there would be little adverse impact to most resources. It then went on to say that was the case if the applicant followed all of the state and local rules and all of the mitigation procedures that were outlined. It then went on to say there were 3 or 4 areas that were of concern where there could be impact. Called out spills possibility, called out cultural resources related to Native Americans, called out wetlands and some other areas where trees and shrubs would not be put back after the pipeline was put in. Mm-hmm. The statement, the environmental impact statement is very long. The summary is just a page, but there are many other pieces throughout the document.
Isn't it true that the State Department's own environmental impact statement included review of an alternative not to build the pipeline at all? And didn't the environmental impact statement conclude that building the pipeline along the preferred route was better environmentally than no pipeline at all?
In the environmental impact statement, we looked at many alternative routes, and we analyzed those. And we looked at routes that avoided the sandhills. We looked at routes that took short little jogs and made different changes. The environmental impact statement did not identify any of those alternative routes as more preferable to the proposed route at that time, based on sort of the different environmental considerations that the different routes had, as well as economic and some technical issues. But, Mr. Chairman, the denial of this permit is related not to all of these pieces, but to the timeline that we had, and that we did not have a complete route to look at this point.
Well, Ms. Jones, reading directly from the Federal Environmental Impact Statement, it says, as a result of these considerations, the Department of State does not regard the no-action alternative, that is, not to build a pipeline, we do not regard that alternative to be preferable to the proposed project. So this language in here is very clear that as opposed to not doing anything, the State Department concluded it was preferable to build a pipeline. So we find ourselves confused about how all of a sudden the State Department and the President reverses themselves on this. After all, this was a study that went on for 40 months or so. My time's expired. At this time, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Jones, most people would agree that haste makes waste. So my question is, why did the State Department recommend that the President deny the Keystone XL pipeline application?
What we recommended the denial because we felt we did not have the time to get the information that was needed on the alternative routes in Nebraska, and with not getting that information, we would also be unable to look at the other factors, socioeconomic factors, environmental factors, as well as foreign policy and energy security. We did not have the time to do that, and that is why we recommended denial. It was not based on the merits of the project.
Well, and why maybe you can further explain this, why was the, quote, full assessment, end quote, not completed by the arbitrary deadline set forth by the Republican bill? And what additional issues did the State Department not have time to consider?
Right. In November, when we identified that there was the need for additional information and in-depth analysis on alternative routes that would avoid the ecologically unique area of the Sandhills in Nebraska, we recognized that there are many pieces to that information. And the first piece, which we don't have yet, is to just identify what some of those alternative routes may be. So we don't even have a complete route for this pipeline, which goes through the whole part of the center part of the country. That's one thing we don't have. We also don't have the level of detail. If we were to have a route, we would then have to get into the level of detail regarding all of the different kinds of information. The topography, the number of bodies of water crossed, if it crossed any aquifers, and then we would have to also look at if there are any endangered species issues, and of course we would have to interact with the communities along that new route to hear their concerns and to understand what any issues might be there. So that overall process would take several months, and the estimate that we put out there was supported approximately by both the applicant and the state of Nebraska when we talked to them about this. So this is a process that we had defined and worked with partners, both the applicant and the state of Nebraska, to understand what would be needed to get the information that we thought we needed to make a decision that would be very well informed.
Do you think then that it would have been irresponsible, reckless, and potentially harmful to the American public had you tried to make grant permits within these artificial deadlines as established by the Republicans in this situation?
Well, I think it would have been irresponsible because we didn't have defined a significant portion of a major pipeline that would be a major piece of infrastructure that would affect our country for many years. So I think having that information was an important piece, and that's what we based our first decision on in November 10th, and this most recent decision is based on the fact that we did not have the time to get the information we think we needed. Mm-hmm.
In all of your experience in your particular role in your capacity at the State Department, have you ever had any similar instances whereby Congress enacted some artificial deadline that did not allow you the time to thoroughly and completely perform your responsibilities to the American public?
Not that I can recall, Congressman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rush. At this time, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I need to make a disclosure before I ask my questions. My congressional district in Texas, if it were a state, at one time would have been the 5th largest energy producing state in the country. I have producing oil wells, producing natural gas wells. I have producing coal mines. I have coal-fired power plants. I have gas-fired power plants. I have oil pipelines. I have natural gas pipelines. I have water pipelines existing, they're in use, and some that are not in use but are still underground. I have big pipelines and little pipelines. So I think I know a little bit about this subject. I have listened with interest to the gentlelady from the State Department's explanation, and I will say that she puts the best face possible on a terrible decision that her department has made. One of the things that you just said, Madam Secretary, was that there were socioeconomic factors that had to be considered. Where is that in the law, especially the State Department? Socioeconomic factors.
Congressman,
No, is it in the law? I don't need a long dodge answer. Is there a statute under law that says the State Department has to consider socioeconomic factors? Yes or no?
It's in the executive order.
Oh, it's in the executive order. That's not a law.
It's in NEPA as well, sir.
I see. Well, I'd like you to provide it if that's the case. Is it a socioeconomic factor that a project might bring thousands of high-paying jobs to a region? Is that a socioeconomic factor?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Is it a socioeconomic factor that a project might bring much-needed energy to the mid-continent and the lower southwest and southeastern states? Is that a socioeconomic factor?
Yes, it is.
Okay. And were those considered?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
The decision at this time was not based on those factors. It was
So
based on
is
the
that
timing.
those socioeconomic factors might be the reason that until the radical environmentalists begin to protest and petition against it, that when the Secretary of State was asked out in California the status of the application, she indicated that she was inclined, or the State Department was inclined, to approve it. Is that a fair statement?
We were considering all of those factors that you mentioned, Congressman, but we were unable to complete that analysis because of the deadline that was put forward.
What is the statutory deadline in the law for consideration? Isn't it 180 days after receipt of the application?
I'm not sure, sir.
Okay. I know it's not 4 years. Okay. I think it's I'm not going to swear it's 180 days, but I think it is 180 days.
My understanding is that in previous cases where we have reviewed pipelines, it has taken 2 years or so. So I don't know what the statutory timeline is.
Okay. Well, there are 3 phases of a pipeline. You have the construction phase, you have the operation phase, and unfortunately, on occasion, you can have a catastrophic accident once it's in operation. Were there concerns about the construction of the pipeline? What I'm trying to get at is the primary concern of the State Department. Is it a construction phase concern? Is it an operation phase concern? Or is it a concern about some sort of a catastrophic event that would spill oil out into the environment?
Our concern at this point, sir, was that we did not have time to do the analysis. All of the dimensions of the issue that you're talking about, we had been studying. Certainly the spills, certainly the issues around construction and operation, but the reason the decision was taken was because we did not have the time.
Well, we fought and won World War II in less time than it's taken so far to evaluate this project. I mean, with all due respect, it is an insult to the American people to say that you need more time. There are 10 other agencies that reviewed this project, and correct me if I'm wrong, but My understanding is that the Corps of Engineers approved it, the Department of Agriculture approved it, the Energy Department approved it, the Department of Interior approved it, the Department of Transportation approved it, the Environmental Protection Agency, believe it or not, approved it, the Defense Department approved it, the Justice Department approved it, the Homeland Security Department approved it, and the Department of Commerce approved it. Only the State Department, which I believe by law is required to look at the international implications since it's trans-Canada, only the State Department did not approve it.
Gentleman's
With that,
time's expired.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
This time I'd like to recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. When we first held a hearing on this subject a year ago, there were press reports that Koch Industries would be one of the big winners, in quote, if this pipeline was constructed. And we asked Koch Industries whether this was true.
Will the gentleman yield?
No. And we were told they have no interest whatsoever in the pipeline. But then we learned that they've told the Canadian government they have a direct and substantial interest. Something doesn't add up. And I have before me a document. This is the application for intervenor status in Canada. And this application says that this is an application from a company called Flint Hills Resources Canada, or Flint Hills, which is a subsidiary of Koch Industries. And they said, what is your specific interest in this proceeding? They said, Flint Hills Resources of Canada is among Canada's largest crude oil purchasers, shippers, and exporters, coordinating supply for its refinery in Pine Bend, Minnesota. Consequently, Flint Hills has a direct and substantial interest in the application. Mr. Chairman, I'd like this document to be made part of the record.
Without objection.
This document raises the issue that the statement that Koch Industries was not involved is inaccurate, because they are involved and they claimed to intervene in Canada because they are involved. And that's why I think we need to get more information. Now, the Keystone XL tar sands pipeline poses substantial risks for Americans. This would pump tar sands almost 2,000 miles across the middle of America, from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico. Even if the pipeline is rerouted around Nebraska, Sandhills, it will almost certainly still go through the Ogallala Aquifer, endangering water supplies for 2 million Americans, their farms, and their businesses. The State Department's analysis indicates that shifting to tar sands oil from crude oil would increase carbon pollution, and that increase could be substantial. Well, these are risks. They're real and they're serious. The benefits for oil companies are also real. They will finally be able to export tar sands to Asia. Port Arthur is even a tax-free trade zone, but the benefits for Americans are a lot less clear. Dr. Jones, how many jobs would the pipeline generate according to the State Department's analysis? Your mic is...
Microphone. No. The economic analysis and economic consideration is part of the review we had been doing that was cut short with the deadline we faced, but the final environmental impact statement we approximated based on the number of work crews that would be used to build the pipeline, that 5,000 to 6,000 construction jobs would be needed per year.
Per year for how many years?
For 2 years.
Well, the oil industry has been saying this would create 20,000 or even 100,000 jobs. They haven't provided any information to us supporting those claims or challenging your estimate. Have they submitted information to you challenging your estimate?
Congressman, we have seen many different estimates on the number of jobs that would be created with this pipeline, and the job creation issue is a very complicated issue because...
But have the oil companies challenged your data and your claim?
Well, we've had a lot of challenges coming from a lot of different directions, but we have... That is a number that we have gotten through the...
Okay, let me get back to my time, because as soon as my time's up, that gavel is going to be smashed. On the Washington Post claimed that this project will create tens of thousands of jobs. This was called a two Pinocchio challenge when this statement was made. The economy is recovering. We need millions of new jobs to reduce unemployment, get the economy moving again. The President proposed an American Jobs Bill. Instead of doing that legislation, we're considering legislation to ram through one pipeline. I think that's a pitiful excuse for a jobs policy. I want to ask you about the review. Dr. Jones, assuming that TransCanada reapplies for permit and the State Department is still the relevant agency, you'll need to assess the application in light of a new route. Will you commit to examine questions about other questions about addressing U.S. carbon emissions and climate change when you look at this question?
Congressman, should a new application be submitted, it would be reviewed without prejudice, and we would look at all of the different aspects of the project. And as you mentioned, certainly greenhouse gases, as well as the economic considerations and other broader environmental issues, foreign policy, everything would be considered. And we would just do that in all fairness and transparency, as we have tried to do with this process, and it would be a new application.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your generosity on the time.
At this time, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Sullivan, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to yield 1 minute of my time to my friend from Kansas, Mr. Pompeo.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, I've sat here for a year and watched the folks on the left obsess about one of my constituents, Koch Industries. But today we reached a new place. We reached a place where they've now asked a private company to come talk about whether they happen to benefit from a particular permit application. This makes no sense to me. We're supposed to do good policy. We're not supposed to decide whether a particular company benefits or not. I can't understand why whether Koch Industries benefits or not would be relevant to our decision. We should decide if this is in the American national interest. I would not for a moment suggest that we should bring Warren Buffett in to testify about whether his company and his rail interests would benefit from this permit application. I've read that he would be greatly benefited if we do not get that permit approved. I cannot believe that anyone on this committee would have their decision on whether or not to vote for this piece of legislation turn on whether Koch Industries or any other private company benefited or was harmed by this. This is not what we're supposed to be doing. The Constitution tells us we're supposed to do good public policy, and we should not be making decisions based on whether one company or another benefits. I yield back.
Mr. Pompeo, Mr. Sullivan didn't want you to go over 1 minute.
Well, thank you, Mr. Pompeo. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Sullivan.
Thank you, Ms. Jones, for being here today. And it's taken, 3 years, no decision, and my constituents are wondering about this, and I know the government's kind of slow, but when do you think you could make a decision? Do you think 10 years from now? Or we need to reapply, or when do you think you can make a decision?
Congressman, when we made the decision in November that we needed additional information, we put an estimate out there that it would take to probably the first quarter of 2013. But at this time, we recommended the denial because we didn't have the time to do that.
These other departments seem to approve. We heard from Mr. Barton about that. Why are they so nimble and you're so slow?
Congressman, I didn't have a chance to respond to Congressman Barton's comments, but we did not finish the national interest determination of consultations with other agencies. So
Okay.
I was not clear as to what kind of
All right.
approval that was
Okay.
referring to, because we didn't finish the process.
Okay, well, Ms. Jones, on January 11th, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton made remarks calling Iran's Strait of Hormuz threats provocative and dangerous. She also called the strait the lifeline that moves oil and gas around the world. According to the Department of Energy, about 15.5 million barrels of oil a day, or a sixth of the global consumption, passes through the Strait of Hormuz between Iran and Oman at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. The fact is that crude oil futures have risen 7.4% since December 16th on increasing concern that Iran, OPEC's second largest producer, would close the passage in the face of pressure from the U.S. and European governments to abandon a suspected nuclear weapon program. In light of these national and energy security threats from Iran, why has it taken 3 years for the State Department to review the Keystone XL pipeline? And do you agree that it is in our national interest for the United States to be more energy independent from regimes such as Iran that want to harm our way of life and pose energy security threats? And would you agree that fluctuating oil prices demonstrate how our economic and national security is threatened by reliance on unstable sources of oil. And Ms. Jones, as you noted earlier, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton is concerned about Iran's provocative actions in the Strait of Hormuz. Does the State Department share the same concerns with our good friend and neighbors, Canada? Yes or no? On the Canada thing.
Yes, we share a commitment with Canada to work towards energy security. It is one of the areas that is part of our very strong bilateral relationship. And as you point out, the whole issue of energy independence and energy security is a very important national priority, and it was and is one of the considerations when pipelines are being reviewed. We did not have the opportunity to complete that review. We did not have a complete route for this pipeline. That's the reason why we took the action, made the recommendation that we did last week. It's only partially defined, this pipeline, at this point.
Well, Ms. Jones, the Keystone XL pipeline is a game changer for energy security. The pipeline, when fully completed, could transport nearly 1.3 million barrels of oil per day from Alberta and North Dakota to refineries in the Midwest and Gulf Coast. I believe that it is in our national interest to move forward with this pipeline, and the State Department's 3-year delay in considering this pipeline is a national travesty, and I wish it would have happened a lot sooner. Thank you, and I yield back.
This time I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gonzalez, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and good morning to the witnesses. And first, full disclosure, I support the building of the pipeline. And I also believe that given the proper timelines to look at all factors, that eventually this application will be approved with recommendations. It is a matter of time, and I will agree that time is of the essence and that we need to move forthwith. However, not to rush it. We can still do this properly and address all the concerns that have been mentioned by the two witnesses. I believe that it will lead to energy security. It is my understanding if we do this, the total production out of Canada and the United States will exceed the production of Saudi Arabia. That, to me, is energy security. I also believe it will result in more jobs in America, just merely on the construction side. I also believe that it will lead to more jobs as a result of the United States being an exporter of fuel. Now, the only problem I have is a representation that is consistently made by members of this committee and on the floor that this is going to inure to the benefit of the American consumer in lower gasoline prices. That is not going to happen. And the sooner they acknowledge that it is a world market and the leading export for the United States last year, according to a story that appeared in Associated Press on the last day of last year, was fuel. Fuel. And there's tremendous implications for the United States as a result of that. But as a result of world market forces and selling it to the highest bidder means that the American public is not going to be paying less for fuel. And we need to continue to emphasize alternative means and fuels and hybrids and more efficiency and conservation. The only real reservation I have is that we're placing all our eggs in one basket, and it may be the Keystone Pipeline, and it is a distraction from pursuing more responsible energy policies that truly will lead to energy independence in this country, but in a way that is safe and is cleaner, more efficient, and cheaper to the American people. But this is part of it. I do believe that it's part of it. Now, Dr. Jones, there has not been made any final determination on the application. And is it clear from your testimony that the reason it has not been approved is that you have not been given sufficient time?
Yes, sir. That's the reason.
And Mr. Wright, let me ask you. Now, you're not new to your job. I asked my staff to look into your background. I think you've been with FERC since the inception of the department that you work with.
In 1979, I began at FERC.
And your testimony today is based, since 1979, your testimony today that what we're attempting to do, or the proposition to basically circumvent or introduce a new process at this point in time, would not be workable in its present form. Is that correct?
Well, my testimony is based upon my experience with the siting of natural gas pipelines under the Natural Gas Act.
Okay.
Given the strictures of the Natural Gas Act and my experience with gas pipelines, trying to extrapolate to oil pipelines, it doesn't appear that would be enough time, as I mentioned, for procedures to be followed with public notice, public comment, time allowed to do an appropriate study under the National Environmental Policy Act.
Well, this is not the first time that Congress is unhappy with basically one department or one agency, and we try to transfer it to another, and the other agency or department is telling us it's still not going to work with the wording and the process that we are proposing. So I'm hoping that we are listening. I hope that we can all be on one page, understanding if we do this properly and correctly, it will be beneficial to the people of the United States of America in every respect. But let's just give it the time that is necessary. And with that, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
This time I recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So many questions, so little time. Thanks for you all coming. Last night, the President used a great phrase that was really coined by Republicans a couple years ago, which is that we need an all-the-above energy strategy. In fact, I was sitting with my friend on the other side of the aisle, and I looked at him, and he goes, yeah, he should have credited you, Shimkus, for that phrase. All the above means all the above: nuclear, solar, wind, natural gas, crude oil, energy security. So we applaud him for that statement based upon that definition. We had members, I mean, I want to continue to frame this debate. This is not a partisan debate by members of the House of Representatives. When the first Keystone Bill passed, 47 Democrats joined us in that piece of legislation. I think the vote was 279 to 147. This is not also a debate against business versus labor, because we had right at the same table you're at a strong group of friends from organized labor, from the laborers to the operating engineers, all supporting this. And why? They support it for job creation. Last night in the speaker's box, we had the owner and manufacturer of pipe has already built 600 miles of pipe from Arkansas, which is not part of your job calculations of job creation if you're just considering people who are putting the pipe in the ground. You fail to mention the people who built the pipe and the coke and the coal that goes into steel making, nor do you consider the people who created the electric generators for the pumping stations. So that's where it's easy to say at 20,000 jobs, because, you know, we build pipelines. And you know how many people it takes for a mile of pipe. So you just multiply that by 1,700. 1,600, 660, I think, is the mileage. Hence you get, so it's not, doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out the job creation statistics, and that's why organized labor, who's usually not real friendly to the Republican side, joined us, joined 47 members of the Democrat side, and was very, very supportive of this piece of legislation. So just on the record. Another issue in the speaker's box, I had 2 refinery managers from close to my current district, and then it'll be in my new congressional district. Ray Brooks from the Marathon Oil refinery in Robinson, Illinois. Hundreds of jobs. And they're already using oil sands right now from the Keystone pipeline. So we've done research on moving oil sands crude through pipelines. We're already doing it. Also in attendance was Mr. Jay Churchill, the manager of the ConocoPhillips company in Wood River. The ConocoPhillips refinery for the past 3 years, had a $2 billion expansion to be able to refine and crack this new crude oil. Thousands of members of organized labor were on the ground during the worst economic times. That's why I'm proud to continue to talk about the brown economy. You talk about energy security growing our country, and what my friend Mr. Gonzalez said is absolutely correct. The brown economy creates more, better, high-paying jobs with great benefits, and it doesn't get the credit that it deserves. So for Ms. Jones, just because I guess I should ask a question. Did you know that in a Wall Street Journal, January 4th, that the Athabasca Oil Sand Company sold 40% of their oil sands interest? Do you know to which country?
No, sir, I do not.
China. You know why?
No.
Because they will now have the controlling interest of that oil field, so they can do what? Develop it. What is, in political speak, what does profoundly disappointment mean in State Department, international relations speak? What does profoundly disappointment mean?
Sir, it usually means that exactly what it says.
They're ticked off, I hear. In State Department language, they are very angry.
That one.
I think the Chinese are profoundly pleased. The Canadians, our allies, are profoundly disappointed. And I yield back my time.
This time I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm glad to know my colleague from Illinois is now going to represent 2 refineries. I still got 3 more up on you, so
I'm going to work for more. I'm going to work for more.
And I'm also glad you're all for the above, but because I know you traditionally come from a coal area, I'm welcome you to the natural gas and oil caucus. But Mr. Chairman, I realize this hearing's primary focus on H.R. 3548, the North American Energy Access Act. I'm a strong supporter of the Keystone Pipeline and have been from the beginning. We need this product. It's naive to think that by stopping Keystone Pipeline from being built, we're preventing the future production of the Canadian oil sands and mitigated all air quality concerns associated with its production. The environment and safety concerns need to be dealt with, but without this product, we will continue to feed money into countries that hate us for everything we stand for. Having said that, I don't think we should be rewriting a long-standing process for one pipeline, which is why I do not support this bill, and particularly the approach to last week's decision. But I do have some questions about the process, and I'll use my time to address it. Ms. Jones, the executive branch exercised permitting authority over the construction and operation of pipelines, et cetera, for petroleum, literally since the executive order in 1968. Is that correct? And with executive order from President Bush 13-337, amended that authority to procedures associated with review, but did not substantially alter the exercise of that authority with the delegation to the Secretary of State. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Ms. Jones, how many permits have been issued under this order since 1968 for pipelines crossing international boundaries?
I know of 3.
I'm sorry?
I know of 3 at this point. I'm not sure if that's accurate.
Okay. I guess because I have a district in Texas and most of our pipelines would come from Mexico instead of Canada, but it seemed like there would be a number of them that cross international borders between Mexico and the United States and, of course, Canada. What is the average time that these permits have taken? And it's my understanding that other pipelines similar nature have been granted permits between 18 and 24 months.
That's right. It's been about 2 years or so.
Okay. And I know the State Department issued a favorable environmental impact statement in August on the pipeline, and then you held several public hearings as part of the interagency review. And by the way, I appreciate the State Department a couple of years ago granting my request for a hearing in eastern Harris County and east of Houston. Actually, it was in Congressman Poe's district, but it was right across the street from mine, where we could have our constituents talk about it. You held those hearings, and when you announced in November that you were delaying decision, you pointed to concerns raised by Nebraskans about the pipeline going through Sand Hills. My question centers on the language included in the payroll tax extension that allowed for TransCanada, the State Department of Nebraska, to continue to work on the alternative route through Nebraska. I understand the President's frustration was at having to decide in a 60-day time frame, but given the favorable EIS, the 57 special safety conditions agreed upon by the operator and language allowing for the Nebraska issue to be dealt with, why were you not able to make the decision in 60 days? Because the average time was 18 to 24 months for previous pipelines, and this has been well over 3 years now. Why wasn't 60 days enough time?
Congressman, we felt we did not have the information we needed, particularly related to alternative routes in Nebraska. And since we did not have that, we didn't have all of the other related information that would go along with that route, and that's a significant portion of the pipeline. So it was an arbitrary timeline, and we knew it would take more time for us to do the analysis.
Granted, it was arbitrary, but again, previous permits have taken 18 to 24 months. Now, this is the longer pipeline than others. I know the original Keystone Pipeline that goes into Congressman Shimka's district in Indiana is much shorter, but it just seems like 3.5 years is plenty of time. And to give someone 60 days and say, okay, you've done all this environmental studies, you need to make a decision, even though the pipeline, I have to admit, my colleague from Nebraska, Mr. Terry, may have a different opinion, but there are pipelines crossing sand hills right now. Did your EIS find that out?
No, sir. We didn't see any oil pipelines crossing the sand.
Okay, there are 6 pipelines. And I'm not sure whether they're natural gas or what product they have, but there are already 6 pipelines. And I understand this pipeline route would be in that easement that's already being used by other products. And so that's the frustration. And, Mr. Chairman, I know I'm almost out. In fact, I am out of time. I don't know if we're going to have a second round or not, but I'd be glad to submit a follow-up question.
Okay. I doubt that we are, because we're going to be voting on the floor, and then I think there's going to be a ceremony for Ms. Gifford.
Well, I'd like to, like we always do, if we could submit questions both to, because I didn't even get to FERC, but to the State Department.
This time I recognize the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Walden, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I welcome our witnesses today. This is interesting. I've been reading through the FEIS to a certain extent, and I know you all are quite familiar with it. You know, on November 12, 1973, the United States House of Representatives under Democrat control took a similar sort of action in approving the Trans-Alaska Pipeline on a vote of 361 to 14 and 60. They deemed that that pipeline met the standards. Senate took it up and approved it on a 49-49 tie, and then Vice President Spiro Agnew cast the deciding vote. And that pipeline continued. Now, that was 800 miles of pipeline. It was brought oil out of Prudhoe Bay, and it was about that period that we had the Arab oil embargo. And President Nixon at the time said, you know, we've got to do something about using America's energy reserves, and alas, the pipeline came along and was deemed approved by Congress. So this is not an unheard of act to grant sufficiency. Now, maybe in the State Department, you've not been involved in one of these. I get that. As somebody that represents a district that has 55% federal land and have watched things over the years, I believe in the Clinton administration there were circumstances involving forestry where NEPA was deemed to have been sufficiently achieved in a cleanup down in Texas after a windstorm, and I think even in North Dakota, maybe South Dakota, after a fire. It's not unheard of, and the Congress has done it before. I want to get on the issue of jobs. In your final EIS on 3.10.58, it says that there's $7 billion to construct the proposed project. We don't have any disagreement on that number, do we? It's $7 billion. And then you talk about the number of jobs, and in the FEIS, it talks about hiring of 5,000 to 6,000 workers over the 3-year construction period. The related income benefits would be substantial. These are the words of the FEIS, and would generate, proposed project would generate $349.4 million in total wages. That's in the FEIS. And if the maximum construction workforce were 6,000 people, a total of $419.28 million in wages would be generated. You also talk about the effect beyond that. These numbers are only related just to the actual construction of the pipeline, correct?
Yes, sir.
And I was trying to find table 2.1 3.2-1 to get into the more localized, because that's the 5,000 to 6,000 jobs aren't the only jobs related to approval of this construction of the pipeline, are they?
That's right. I didn't get a chance to speak to the indirect jobs.
I'm going to give you that chance right now, because I believe, I mean, I have a company, I mean, there's a company in Oregon that's building the pumps for the XL pipeline, and can you talk to us? Where would I find, not where, but tell me what the FEIS says relative to the total number of jobs, both construction, direct, and all the indirect jobs associated, were the President to approve this. What's your best estimate?
We were in the process of analyzing the indirect jobs, and there are multiple models that people use for that.
Sure.
We did not complete that because of the timeline we were handed, and we have.
It's not in the FEIS, the
final
final environmental impact statement?
We have the direct job numbers in there. We don't have the indirect. We were looking at that through the national interest determination and engaging with other agencies. We have some rough estimates that are similar to what the applicant is saying in terms of.
And what would those be?
I think it was approximately 35,000 per year.
For how many years?
Well, that's another point of discussion. One timeline was extraordinarily long, and there's been a lot of confusion about using person years versus particular jobs. But we did not.
How then, in the executive summary of the FEIS, does it say operation of the proposed project would also result in long-term to permanent beneficial socioeconomic impacts, including employment and income benefits resulting from long-term hires and local operating expenditures and increased property tax revenues? An estimated $140.5 million in annual property tax revenues would be generated by the proposed project. Somebody's done some of that to get to that, right?
Yes, some of that is in the FEIS, but that's only one piece of the analysis, and we did not finish the rest of it. We recognize that the economic impact is a very important consideration, but we did not finish that because we do not have the complete route for this pipeline.
My time's expired.
This time, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I just think the discussion over this Keystone Pipeline, the back and forth has been unfortunate, and it sort of mirrors the discussions we have on energy policy in general. People talk about the need for us to have an all-of-the-above strategy, but you hear that said a lot, but in reality and in practice, this seems to always be an either-or strategy on this committee when we have energy debates. If you're for coal or if you're for oil, then you can't be for solar and wind and vice versa. And the reality is we do need to do all of this if we're going to have energy security in the country. And we need to pay particularly attention to these nascent technologies in clean energy that are slowly but surely over time going to start to replace fossil fuels because, as we all know, fossil fuels are an infinite supply. That's a supply that's going to go down, and something has to take its place. Now, it's not going to take its place tomorrow. It's not going to take its place even 5 or 10 years from now. But if we don't start making investments in clean energy now, we're going to be in trouble down the road. So we need to do that also. But having said that, it is in our interest to develop domestic supplies in this country and also to continue the relationship that we have with Canada. This pipeline is a small piece of that puzzle. And let's not delude ourselves, as Mr. Gonzalez said, that this is a silver bullet for anything. This is not going to lower people's gas prices, and this pipeline will not result in us having to no longer buy oil from OPEC nations. That's just not accurate, and we shouldn't make people think that that is the case. You know, there's going to be 800,000 tons of steel pipe in this project. I wish I could sit here and say that that steel's coming from the United States of America. Unfortunately, TransCanada is contracted with an Indian multinational company, Wellspun Corp Limited, and a Russian company to manufacture the steel pipe for the Keystone XL pipeline. Now, as someone coming from Pittsburgh, where we still make steel and headquarters of U.S. Steel, I'd feel a lot better about this project, too, if just one little drop of U.S. steel was being made in this pipeline. Now, it's unfortunate that it isn't. Having said all of that, I think that probably what's doomed this application more than anything
was the politics that's been played when we passed the Payroll Tax Act to put this 60-day clause and put this gun to the president's head and said you have to make this decision in 60 days. And it's just pure election year politicking that's been going on this issue. I agree with Mr. Gonzalez that eventually, after the environmental reviews are done with this and we make sure that we have a route that is environmentally safe and that all these things are checked, that this project should move forward. But not until we do that. And I don't think we're there yet. This legislation in front of us from a good friend of mine, Lee Terry, who I have tremendous affection and respect for, once again imposes this artificial deadline of 30 days and takes this out of the hands of the State Department to an agency that does gas pipelines but not oil pipelines. I think it's a misguided effort. So with the time I have left, I do want to ask a couple questions. Secretary Jones, I know we had planned earlier to have the Nebraska DEQ with us today, but for whatever reason, Mr. Linder is not appearing today. But I note in his testimony, he lays out a timeline for his state intended to follow to establish this new route through Nebraska and complete any necessary environmental reviews and allow for public comment. Mr. Linder said in his statement that if this were done on an aggressive schedule, a new route could be approved by October of 2012 at the earliest. Ms. Jones, does the State Department believe that the 60-day timeline laid out in the payroll tax bill have allowed for a complete recommendation from the state of Nebraska on the new route for the pipeline?
No, sir. We feel that we do need the time that Mr. Linder had put out in his estimate. We had talked to both the Department of Environmental Quality as well as to the applicant, and the estimates of time that came in from all of us were within the same range.
Thank you. Has the State Department ever recommended a pipeline be in the national interest without having the entire proposed route before them? Have you ever done that before?
No, sir.
Was there any indication that the state of Nebraska would be able to complete a modified route proposal by February 21st, 2011, which was the deadline imposed in the Payroll Tax Act?
No, sir, and that is why we felt we could not go forward.
Thank you. Did this lack of a complete route proposal? I see my time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And Mr. Doyle, I'm trying to get through everybody before we have to go vote because we're not going to be able to come back. So thank you. Mr. Terry, you recognize 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I have great affection and respect for my friend from Pittsburgh. Just to add some clarification, I think it's about 60 to 65% of the steel in this pipeline is U.S. steel. In fact, Mr. Shimkus mentioned that. The reason why Mr. Linder isn't here is because our State Department, Dr. Jones, objected to him being on the panel because it was beneath them to have a state official. So that's why he's not here. And that his testimony.
Would my friend yield for just 1 second?
Well, I've got a lot of questions. There's an email chain verifying that that was their objection. I may have put a little editorial to it, but let me just state that I am profoundly disappointed that the State Department objected to Mr. Linder being on the panel, and therefore he is not. Now, for the record, I would like to introduce a media note from the State Department, April 15th, saying, in conclusion, the U.S. State Department expects to make a decision whether to grant or deny the permit before the end of 2011. Another one making the same statement of March 15th, 2011. Executive Office of the Management of Budget from the White House saying the same thing, that they are working, the State Department and all entities are working diligently and will have all of the information they need and will be able to make their decision by December 31st. 2011. I'd like to submit those for the record. Then the point here is that we're using the state of Nebraska as the excuse to delay the decision until after the election. I don't think it's any coincidence that the State Department and the entities feel like they would be in a position to make a decision within about 60 days after the election. I think the point, or that they said in the first quarter of 2013, it certainly flies in the face of all of their previous statements. And I read from a quote from Environment News Service. I don't have the date handy on it, but it is after the Nebraska legislature met. Carrie Ann Jones, Assistant Secretary of the State, said, quote, "I am confident that the department and Nebraska authorities would be able to efficiently work together in preparing any documents necessary to examine the alternative routes in the state of Nebraska that satisfy the federal laws and any state law of Nebraska." So they were all set and ready to go with the state of Nebraska. Now, if Mr. Linder would have been allowed to participate in this hearing today, but for the objections of the State Department, he would have said on December 1st, 2011, we contacted the State Department to begin to explore the process of entering into an MOU between two agencies which would outline responsibilities and define a schedule. We received the first draft of the agreement from the State Department within the next 2 weeks and exchanged comments, to which what we considered to be an executable document, which we submitted to the State Department in December 2011. No further progress had been made on that front. I think it's odd or interesting that the State Department in the middle of December 2011 decided that they weren't going to work on this project anymore, and then come in here and say they don't have enough times. In the legal field, there's a doctrine of clean hands. You can't be the one delaying it and then object to the delays. May I also submit for the record the actual language of the bill that was signed into law that created the Nebraska exemption. Let me wait for just a second on that one, because as I understand from reading your report to Congress, you are objecting because not later than 60 days after the enactment of this act, the President, acting through the Secretary of State, shall grant a permit under Executive Order 13337 for the Keystone XL pipeline. You've said many times in your testimony and answers today, Dr. Jones, that it is that 60-day requirement, the absurdity that, darn. But yet there's a Nebraska exemption in here that specifically said that's carved out, and that 60 days for Nebraska doesn't run until all of the reports are done and certified by the governor. Darn, I yield back.
Sorry, we're going to have some votes. Dr. Burgess, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Jones, according to some information that I have, that October 15, 2010, Secretary of State Clinton said she was inclined to approve Keystone's permit. On October 31, 2011, White House Press Secretary that is over a year later, White House Press Secretary Jay Carney stated, "The fact is, this is a decision that will be made by the State Department or is housed within the State Department." The very next day, President Obama said the decision would rest with him. In the President's announcement last week to reject the pipeline's permit, he said he had accepted the State Department's recommendations to do so. So everything seems to be pointing to you guys at the State Department. So can you tell the committee who it was that who was the one who made the call, made the decision to reject the Keystone XL permit?
Congressman, based on the act, the Payroll Tax Cut Act, which had specific language into it regarding what the President needed to do in a certain time, we, the State Department, recommended to the President.
Who we? Who is we?
We is the Deputy Secretary, through the Secretary to the President.
And that person, the name of that person is?
Bill Burns.
Bill Burns was the one who made the decision.
No, he recommended to the President that this decision be taken, and the President decided.
Did the White House exert any influence over the State Department's recommendation?
No, sir.
Well, Mr. Chairman, it seems to me that there's an individual there that is missing then from this hearing today that perhaps we should ask if we should be able to submit some questions to that individual. You know, we all know, the State Department in particular knows what's going on in the state of Hormuz. I was in Iraq in August, and although our military presence now there has wound down, there's still a big State Department footprint in Iraq, isn't there? In Basra, where I was, there is in fact one of the largest State Department operations, and the reason, my understanding, the reason is because that's where Iraq kind of narrows down going to the Gulf, and all of the oil flowing from the southern part of that country will go through Basra and the 4 pipelines that go through there. So it was felt, the State Department felt they needed to have a large presence there. I don't get it. Why do we have to have, I mean, there's jobs there, but I'd rather have the pipeline through Texas where, yeah, we can be hard to deal with sometimes, but we're not nearly as hard to deal with as people in the Middle East. So just food for thought. Let's build this pipeline where, you know, why make it hard on ourselves? Why make it hard on our country? We need American jobs. We need American energy. This seems so straightforward. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to yield, if he wants the time, to Mr. Pompeo, because are you good? Mr. Terry, did you get to finish everything you needed to do? Generally. I'll yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
This time I recognize the gentleman from Washington State, Mr. Inslee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. My understanding is there's a potential that some of the product that would flow through this proposed pipeline could be exported. It could be used and consumed by other countries rather than consumers in the United States. Under this bill, would the United States government be able to assess the impact of that export on consumer prices in the United States at all?
Congressman, I assume you mean the bill that's proposed here?
Yes, yes.
I can't answer that question as to how that bill would approach it. That consideration was one of the considerations in the national interest determination that we were in the process of doing when we were given this timeline and didn't have a route to really analyze and to have an informed decision.
So I guess the question is, if right now my understanding is this product is being used by American consumers in their gas tanks in their cars. If it goes to the Gulf and then is exported, other people around the world will be bidding on it. We'll be bidding against them for the gasoline when we consume it domestically. In other words, there'll be another person who will be bidding on the product in the export market. I think that has the potential to affect the price we pay at the pump, because now we're competing for the same product with someone else who might be bidding more, which then drives up our prices potentially. Now, I don't know the answer to that question, but I just wonder, under this bill, would the U.S. government assess that as part of this decision-making process?
Do you want to try it?
I would say, as part of the NEPA analysis, as part of the overall national interest analysis, the socio-economic impacts, that would probably be something that would be assessed.
Thank you.
Has the gentleman yield back this time?
Yes.
Okay. I tell you what, we have a vote on the floor. We're not going to be able to come back. We have a lot of people still wanting to ask questions, so I'm going to give everybody 3 minutes in the effort to try to get through everybody. So, Mr. Bilbray, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much. Ms. Jones, what's your experience on these cross-border issues? How long have you been working on cross-border issues for the State Department?
I've been at the State Department since August 2009.
Okay. There are some of us that have more than a passing interest in cross-border and environmental problems. So let me just say, this is a 1,700-mile pipeline. We have 2,300,000 miles of pipeline in this country. How much jurisdiction does the State Department have over that 2 million plus pipe?
The State Department is involved only in permits that cross international boundaries.
Just across that line. Okay, then any environmental impact report or statement obviously looks at the impact of the no project option, what is the emissions that would be created? Oh, first of all, let me back up. What's the ability under NAFTA for Canada to bring trucks across the border?
I don't think I can answer that question, sir.
It's pretty unrestricted, though.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the no project option on a pipeline is to train or truck it across that area. What is the total total emissions annually if we went to that option rather than using a pipeline?
I couldn't give you that number, but I do know that in the final environmental impact statement, there was some analysis done that if the pipeline wasn't built, it was likely that other modes of transportation would pick up and continue to move crude. But
and wouldn't consider the fact that not only would those modes, train and truck, be putting out emissions, but those emissions are diesel emissions, which have been categorized as a toxic emission above and beyond what dioxin is. Did they also point out that trains are 3 times more dangerous with fatalities than a pipeline, and that trucks are, I think the latest number was 87 times more dangerous than a pipeline? So my question is this: did you consider the fact that the no project option or the denial or the delay, the denial would end up having more emissions total that we reflected by use of truck and train?
the denial that was taken last week was based on the fact that we didn't have the time to do all the analysis that you're pointing to.
Let me just say this. I'm very happy to see you approve, the President approve, a cross-border agreement with a private company to be able to operate airports across the border. And the fact is just because the gentleman who's financing it is a billionaire from Chicago, I'm not going to attack that agreement. But I'd ask, when you did this agreement at Otay Mesa, did you consider the increased emissions and the global impact of Mexico's air operations that would be operating in relationship to this border crossing that you approved, that the President approved just recently?
Go ahead and finish. But did you want to?
I wasn't involved with that. I can't respond to that. I could go back and get more from the department.
I'd appreciate that. Thank you for approving that project.
Mr. Scalise, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you having this hearing. Thank the witnesses for coming. I think what irritates me, what irritates a lot of people that are concerned about the economy and getting the economy back on track and creating jobs is that the President made a political decision to throw away 20,000 American jobs and to hurt our relationship with Canada, who's a strong, strong friend of maybe one of the best friends of America in the world. Canada had been trying to get this project done for over 3 years. Is it true, Ms. Jones, that Canada submitted their application for this Keystone XL pipeline back in September of 2008?
The TransCanada, the company, submitted it then, yes.
So, you sit here at the table and the President said this time and time again, he didn't have enough time. He didn't have enough time. He's had 40 months. If you look at the original Keystone pipeline, because this is a separate Keystone, Keystone XL, the original Keystone pipeline was approved back in 2008 after less than 2 years of review. It doesn't take 40 months to review a project like this. And so at some point in time, you got to decide whether you're going to fish or cut bait. And ultimately, that's what Congress decided in a bipartisan way. It's not a partisan issue. It's not a House versus Senate issue. For one of the few things we actually came together on and agreed, Republicans and Democrats, House and Senate, said, Mr. President, stop wasting time, stop delaying this project for political purposes, make a decision, yes or no. And then, unfortunately, he used y'all because y'all, back in August of last year, y'all said this is something you should do. Hillary Clinton, back in 2010, the quote was, we are inclined to do so, when asked about approving the Keystone Pipeline in 2010. And then you go through the timeline, and then you get to August of last year, where y'all came out with your report, and you basically said this is something that we should do. We don't see any real problems with the Keystone Pipeline. I'll use the exact, there would be no significant impacts. That was State Department on Keystone back in August of 2011. And what happened after that? What happened after that is on November 7th of 2011, radical environmentalists went and had a big rally at the White House. You got Daryl Hannah here, got arrested, real famously got arrested. A bunch of radical environmentalists went and said, Mr. President, don't approve the Keystone Pipeline. They threatened his reelection. And gee whiz, coincidentally, 3 days after this rally by radical environmentalists, the president then reverses course and says, we're going to push the decision on Keystone till after the election. He's the one who gave the arbitrary date. Not because of environmental reasons, because of political reasons, because he was getting beaten up by radical environmentalists who just didn't want this thing approved at all. So he said, I'll just kick the can till after the election and maybe this will go away. And Canada said, we can't wait that long because China wants the oil. They want to do something. They want to participate with us. But instead, the president said, no, we don't want the jobs. Let China get that oil. And now, of course, we go to the statement by the Prime Minister of Canada, who said they're profoundly disappointed with this decision.
Sorry.
He's hurt our relationships and hurt our national security
Mr.
with
Markey,
that political decision.
We're
yield
going
back.
down to 3 minutes because we got votes on the floor. We're running out of time, so you recognize 3 minutes.
Thank you. We have been repeatedly told that we need to get over the concerns about pollution, environment, because the oil coming through this pipeline would enable us to reduce our dependence on oil imported from unfriendly Middle Eastern nations. TransCanada's application for its permit even states that the proposed pipeline will serve the national interests of the United States by providing a secure and reliable source of Canadian crude oil to meet the growing demands by refineries and markets in the United States. However, some have questioned these assertions of energy security benefits, citing plans by Gulf Coast refineries with whom TransCanada has entered into long-term sales contracts to re-export diesel and other fuels made from the Keystone crude to Latin America, Europe, and beyond. In fact, nearly all of these refineries where the Keystone crude will be sent to are located in Port Arthur, Texas, which is designated as a foreign trade zone. This means that if these refineries re-exported diesel or other fuel, they wouldn't even have to pay U.S. taxes on these exports. Earlier this month, Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper said that when you look at the Iranians threatening to block the Straits of Hormuz, I think that just illustrates how critical it is that supply for the United States to be North American. But in December, when I asked the President of TransCanada whether he would agree to ensure that the oil and refined products stay here in this country instead of re-exporting it, he said no, sitting right at this table. In other words, if the permit for this pipeline is legislatively mandated by this bill, the United States may just become the middleman for shipping products made from some of the dirtiest crude oil on earth to foreign markets around the world. Secretary Jones, does the process the administration was following to determine whether Keystone XL was in the national interest allow for the consideration of issues like whether the project would reduce dependence on Middle Eastern oil?
Yes, sir. That's one of the considerations when we look at energy security.
Okay, thank you. So if the Republicans hadn't forced the administration to deny the permit because it wasn't given enough time to review it, the administration could have issued a permit that required the Keystone oil and fuels to be sold only in the United States. Isn't that right?
I'm not sure of that, sir. What we can restrict in terms of exports.
You
That's
could
one of the
restrict it,
questions. No,
but-
we'd have to study that. I don't think that we can restrict exports, but that is something we would continue to study.
That could be in the national interest. Is that correct?
We would
To
have
keep the
study
oil
it.
here?
We would have to study it in regard to export.
No, could it be in the national interest, though, potentially, to keep the oil here?
It would certainly be a consideration, but we were unable to really study all
That's
of that.
right.
We
So
had
we
no
never got a
time.
chance to look at that. Now, for both Ms. Jones and Mr. Wright, does the Republican legislation provide FERC with explicit authority to issue a permit that contains a requirement that the oil or fuels have to be sold in the U.S.? Does it contain that provision?
I did not see that explicit.
Do you, Ms.
consideration.
Jones?
No, I do not see that there.
Okay. Well, make no mistake. I think this is a pipeline
Time's
out of the
expired.
United States and into other countries
Mr.
of this
Olson, you're
world, and we
recognized
just
for...
have to protect ourselves.
I thank the chair for his
We're going to have to
recognition.
go. We're going to have to go down to 2 minutes because we have like 4 minutes left on the floor. 312 people still have not voted, and I want everyone to get an opportunity to say something. So, 2 minutes.
I'll be quick, I promise. I appreciate the witnesses' time today. We all know the benefits of the Keystone XL pipeline. 20,000 jobs, energy from Canada as opposed to Middle Eastern oil, national security, and energy security. And as a former naval aviator who's flown in the Persian Gulf, what we call straight transits, right through the Strait of Hormuz, I have a unique perspective on Iran. And we all know that Iran is threatened to close the straits, stopping 30% of the world's supply of oil from getting to market. And I can't expand upon this enough, but that is a very real threat. The straits are narrow. about 9 miles wide in some places, and they're shallow. If a vessel would sink, vessels in the middle of straits, they'd be blocked for months, if not years. In fact, 3 of our 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers have been deployed to the region because our Commander-in-Chief, our President, sees the threat as real. But State Department has a history of approving new pipelines in the interest of national security because of political tensions. The most recent example is the Alberta Clipper pipeline in the Midwest part of the United States. This is another Canadian pipeline. And let me read you a section from the Record of Decision for the Alberta Clipper pipeline. And this is, I quote, Department of State has determined through review of the Alberta Clipper project application that the Alberta Clipper project would serve the national interest. In a time of considerable political tension in other major oil-producing regions and countries, by providing additional access to approximate, stable, secure supply of crude oil with minimum transportation requirements from a reliable ally and trading partner of the United States, which we have free trade agreements that further augments the security of this energy supply. Why is the situation now different? Surely, yes or no, Mrs. Jones, is the situation now more dire than the situation was when we approved the Alberta Clipper pipeline? Yes or no?
Energy security is still a major priority for this country and this administration. However, we did not reject this project on the merits. It was an issue that we did not have time. Those considerations you raised would be considered if we had the entire route and if we had the time to conduct the process that we feel the American people need to have for this pipeline.
Okay, time's expired.
Ma'am, with all due respect, you changed your mind in October. We didn't change it
Mr.
because
McKinley,
we
you
put a 6-day
recognize 2
deadline. I
minutes.
yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So just some quick questions, and perhaps if you could just respond, Ms. Jones, in writing to us rather than take time, because we're in deference with the time. The first is, could you submit to us a chronological order of the process when since it began in September of 2008, why in God's name it would take 3.5 years to come? I just know from the private sector, firms would be fired for taking that long to go through a process. Can you get back to us as to whether the railroads in Montana and North Dakota and Oklahoma, are those captive railroads? I'd like to, I don't know where they are or not. You understand the term?
I think we'll have to get an answer back to you on that
Sure,
one.
I'm not expecting you to answer these things right now, so I'm asking if you, just for the record, if you'll get back to us on that.
Yes,
with
we
whether or
will.
not these are captive railroads. And can you also respond, please, to the editorial that was in the Investment Business Daily that back on November 16th, in which the editorial board there is trying to is suggesting that there could be a link between the railroad systems and this decision, especially given that it is a political decision. We all know that. Anyone that would postpone this until after the election is already crying out this is a political decision. So since they're linking it to two major individuals, global figures, I'd like to understand what, if your response back to that, or perhaps even the person that made the ultimate decision to cancel this project, because it wasn't based on the time frame. We understand that. And I think the American public is going to come to understand that. But thank you. If you get back to us in writing, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Mr. Gardner, you recognize 2 minutes.
For you, is job creation the #1 national interest? Yes or no? Job creation is the #1 national interest.
Yes.
Does this pipeline create jobs?
Yes,
You
but the
denied
number is
pipeline.
under
That's
debate.
just a yes or no question. Does this, and you denied the pipeline? You denied that you recommended not moving forward with the pipeline.
We denied it based on the
You
time
denied
we
it,
were
and
given.
it's your #1 national interest, so you acted at odds with the #1 national interest.
Sir, we were reviewing the job situation. The
That's
economic
I'll
issue is
accept that
part of the
answer.
review.
You turned it down, that's fine. I want to go back to this mountain of paper here, the final environmental impact statement from August 2011. The EIS identified a particular route as the preferred alternative, yes or no?
Yes.
And among the other alternatives you considered a no-action alternative, yes or no?
Yes.
And the final EIS expressly concluded the preferred alternative was way better than not building a pipeline at all, yes or no?
Yes, but there was more to that. These are simple
It
pieces
says right
coming
here,
out of
as a
the
result of these
FEIS.
considerations, the Department of State does not regard the no-action alternative to be preferable to the proposed project. That's from the final EIS. Thank you. The reason you concluded that, all things considered, transporting the oil from pipeline in a state-of-the-art pipeline is better than shipping of some of it by rail, truck, and cargo ships is because it's better than shipping it from the Middle East. Yes or no? Yes, thank you. You have to agree with that. It's better to ship
Yes,
it from
I do.
Canada. Thank you.
That's part of energy
But
security.
if we delay this, if the White House delays it, we run the risk of no pipeline at all. Your delays run the risk of no pipeline. You've said jobs are the #1 national interest, and yet you've said to the White House, we don't want to do this.
We have to work with the pipeline where we have the route and where we do a
You
comprehensive
have
review
said
for the
jobs are the
people.
#1 national interest, and you have said no to this. These delays risk the killing of this pipeline, and so you will end up with no pipeline, which is not the preferred interest, the preferred alternative, as the Department of State has already said in their final EIS. So if you do this, you're going to have none of the jobs, you're going to kill the jobs, you're going to have none of the energy, and China wins.
Mr. Pompeo, you recognize for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I can do it in 1 minute. I have one question. Ms. Jones, are you lacking any information that you were constrained for time about how this impacts a particular private company? That is, are you interested in how this might or might not affect any particular private company?
No,
Is it
sir.
relevant to your decision at all?
No, sir. We're looking at the issue is the route through Nebraska and all of the impacts that possibly could
Great.
have.
So testimony about how any private company would be impacted would be irrelevant to your decision-making process.
So we're looking at the route as we had explained.
Great. Thank you. One last statement. Mr. Waxman suggested that because Koch Industries had filed as an intervener before the Canadian National Energy Board, that suggested that they must have a financial interest in this transaction. That is just false. This notion that they have an interest there has been shredded. There are many, many interveners, including the Sierra Club of Canada, who I don't think has a financial interest in the Keystone XL pipeline, the Alberta Federation of Labour, the Communications, Energy and Paper Workers of Canada. This is a silly concept, and I want to make sure the record reflected that this mere intervener status makes no indication about whether any company has an interest in this pipeline at all. With that, I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Griffith, you recognize 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I'm sitting here kind of curious. The State Department keeps talking about its studies in Nebraska, but isn't your job supposed to determine what the impact is because it's international, and what the impact is on the international relationship with our friends in Canada?
Because we have the authority for the permitting.
I understand you have the authority for the permitting, but you've got all of this done by the agencies that would normally do that. Isn't your job as the State Department to focus on the relationships with our foreign friends and not to be interfering in internal decisions made by other agencies?
Our job in this situation is to look at the entire pipeline for the impact it could have on the country.
So
as the lead
everything
agency.
these people did was worthless?
No, sir. That's important analytical information.
Well, then why do you have to redo it all? All right,
I've
made my point.
We don't have the route through Nebraska.
I really believe that this was a political decision. You're not supposed to comment on that, and I understand that. But I believe that you had the president in a political quandary with labor versus radical environmentalists, and he had to delay till after the election. That's what I believe, and that's what I believe the evidence shows. I'm not asking for a comment. I would say to you, more oil refined in the U.S., particularly when it's coming from a closer supply, means more jobs in the U.S., more profits in the U.S., more taxes paid to the U.S., and more U.S. supply available. All of those things I think are good things. And because you're from the State Department, I would say that we have damaged our relationship with a good ally and a close neighbor and friend. And to me, that seems counter to the purpose of the State Department. And all of this would indicate that everything that you all are doing is counter to the interests of the United States of America. I yield back.
That concludes today's hearing. I want to thank the 2 witnesses for being with us today, and the record will remain open for 10 days for additional documents, and some questions were submitted to you all, and we would appreciate you all getting that information back to us. Thank you.